2 of the observance or the discussion of Commonwealth realms. Already talked about how the big British Empire was sort of became sort of paranoid about losing colonies due to the experience of the American Revolution. So they decided that they would slowly allow the various colonies to enjoy more and more what they called responsible government, which we would call self-government, so that they would not want to break away. And then I talked about how in Canada you had different colonies that throughout the 1800s were able to enjoy more and more self-government. And then the British decided to, instead of having different little colonies becoming independent countries, they would unite them all into a federation colony. So in 1867, they created Canada, which everyone called the Dominion of Canada, meaning the Kingdom of Canada, which had a national government based in the new capital, Ottawa. The Queen was represented by the Governor-General, and at that time, the Governor-General also represented the British Parliament, as Canada was still considered a British colony. And then they created, and I'm gonna get back to Canada in a little while, because the federations are interesting to look at. And I have this hat I bought at the Rideau Hall. It's this is just a pin I put on there, but that's the lion with the crown and holding the maple leaf. It represents the Governor-General of Canada. I thought I'd wear that. Okay, now, so Canada was the first. Now, a lot of people say 1867 is when Canada became independent, but that's an incorrect understanding of the history. 1867 is when Canada was actually created with the British North America Act. Newfoundland remained a separate self-governing colony and did not choose to join Canada until 1949. Okay? And they became the 10th. They're the oldest settled province in Canada, but they became the newest province number 10, 1949. Australia was another collection of colonies on the continent of Australia, and in 1901 that went into effect, where they created this new federation colony called the Commonwealth of Australia. In 1906, and New Zealand was invited to join, but they were too far away, so they decided to become just their own self-governing dominion. They created the Dominion of New Zealand in 1907. Now, there was another problem or challenge with Southern Africa. You had 2 British colonies, Cape Colony and Natal. And Great Britain attacked, well, technically the Dutch attacked, but the British were instigating it. And so the Boer War broke out in 1899 between the 2 Dutch republics, Republic of South Africa, or Transvaal as it's commonly known, and the Orange Free State, allied together to fight the British. Well, the British Empire, after a very hard-fought war, by the way, which was much harder than they expected, and they had lost a few early battles. And incidentally, when the British lost some of those early battles, the Boers, they call them Boers, that's a Dutch word for farmer, the Afrikaners, received a congratulatory letter from the German foreign ministry saying, "Congratulations on your victory over the British," which really set the British off to no end. And that helped solidify the ongoing enmity between Great Britain and the German Empire. So, but back to the South African situation. They wanted to create another federation colony, so they created the Union of South Africa in 1910, which was the 4 colonies under a central government, with a Governor-General as well to represent the King and the British Parliament. Well, these federation colonies, and then Ireland, they wanted to give Ireland self-government and make it a dominion, but then World War I broke out, and so that put everything on hold. And then you had the IRA, the radicals, who, you know, with all their self-defeating radicalism, they could have had independence in for all of Ireland, probably by 1920. But you know how these radical socialist groups are, they in a hurry, so they want to use violence. So then they ended up getting independence in 1922, which went into effect in 22 for much of Ireland, but Northern Ireland is still British today. So they may have been, if they wouldn't have been so in a hurry, they may have had Ireland today as an independent country, maybe a Commonwealth realm, but all united. But the IRA always were past masters of stupidity. But going on, they did make Ireland minus Northern Ireland, which stayed a British territory until today, part of the United Kingdom even today. They created the Irish Free State, which was a dominion. Still had a Governor-General that reported to the British government in London. And interestingly, the British still occupied some ports along the coast, which they later turned over to Ireland. It took Ireland a long time to get the British military out of their country. And then in 1949, this new law went into effect where Ireland declared itself the Irish Republic without any connection to the British Crown, because it didn't like the British. So, and they quit the Commonwealth of Nations. So they're not even affiliated, but they are united with Great Britain and the European Union, which had nothing really to do with the British governmental system. All right. After World War II, the British, by signing the United Nations Organization Treaty, agreed that they would give up all their colonies, because that was part of joining the United Nations, that you would give up all your colonies if the colonies chose to go independent. Now, some British colonies have stayed colonies because they were just too tiny and chose not to break away, like, for instance, the Turks and Caicos Islands, Montserrat, the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, and Gibraltar in Spain, which is in Spain on the Spanish mainland, the only British colony on the European mainland. But they don't call them colonies today. That's like a politically incorrect term today, so they call them overseas territories. But whatever, it's the same thing. But they wanted to keep India together as a united country, but you had Mahatma Gandhi with all of his antics, and he was able to destroy any chance of Indian unity and getting all the ethnic groups. Not directly, he wasn't trying to do that. I'm just saying with his antics and his ability to think like a brick, he was able to indirectly lead to an explosion of violence and break India apart along ethnic lines. So they just said, well, forget that, it's not going to work. And they actually partitioned India into two new realms, Commonwealth realms, or they still called them at that time dominions: the Union of India, 1947, and the Dominion of Pakistan in 1947. India declared itself a republic and became a republic in 1950. That's their national holiday today, actually, Republic Day, celebrating 1950 when they became they had their own president and no longer a king. Pakistan stayed a dominion, and then in 1952 they started using the term realm, Commonwealth realm, until 1956 when they became a republic. All the Muslim and Arabic countries that were granted independence between 1946 with Jordan and Brunei in 1984 became independent republics or kingdoms, and they did not choose to remain as realms. Brunei has its own sultan, which is a Muslim king. Now, they had a project. They wanted to make some more colony federations, which would end up becoming independent federations, Union of States. They came up with the idea to make the Federation of Central Africa in 1953, which was Northern Rhodesia, today's Zambia, Southern Rhodesia, today's Zimbabwe, in Nyasaland, today Malawi. But there were all kind of problems because Northern Rhodesia was almost all black, and they wanted to have a black ruler and a prime minister. And then Southern Rhodesia had a much larger white minority than Northern Rhodesia. And they were determined they were going to keep a white power base and have a white governor and white prime minister and all that. And Nyasaland was like 99% black. It was only 1% white. So it was never any intention they were going to ever have a white government, you know, once they became independent. But there was always controversy, so it just went on and on. And so in 1963, they dissolved that, and they had their own flag and everything. I mean, it was their own governor, the governor of Central Africa, the Federation of Central Africa. So it was on the way to becoming, could be a country today, just like the Republic of South Africa. But they couldn't get along, so they broke it up in '63, and that led to some other problems with Southern Rhodesia. But get on to that. We won't get onto that. They created the Federation of the West Indies in 1958 with Jamaica, the Bahamas, and you know, all the islands, Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and all of those. They couldn't get along either. Now, they should have gotten along because they were all black, you know, black African immigrants, you know, heritage in a heritage sense. They all spoke English. They all had a common British background. They all were in the Caribbean. It should have worked out really well, but they just was so jealous. Like Jamaica was trying to sort of like tell them what to do, and then the Bahamas didn't want them telling them what to do, and they just could not. They could not get their heads around this idea that we will cooperate. Well, if we cooperate, we could be a strong middle American country, but instead, let's argue, and then we can become a bunch of weak little countries that people will pay no mind to. And then that's what happened. In 1962, the British just said, well, forget it. They broke up the Federation of the West Indies and started to let the colonies become independent as Commonwealth realms, starting with Jamaica in '62 and all the way up until Antigua and Barbuda in '83. And then some of them just went off and became republics, like Dominica. So those were the. Now another one they tried to make a federation of was the Federation of Southern Arabia, South Arabia. Today that's Southern Yemen, which is in the middle of a big civil war, which they have with Northern Yemen about every 10 years. So Yemen had been broken apart in the 1800s, but Aden and the surrounding territories was a British-controlled part of Arabia. They tried to create the Federation of South Arabia, but the Arabs didn't want the British there, and the Soviet Union was helping the Arabs just because, not that they cared about Arabs, because they were trying to hurt the British being allies with America during the Cold War. So in 1967, the British finally just said, screw it, we're leaving, let them do what they want. And the Federation of South Arabia became whatever it was, the People's Republic of Yemen, or the Yemen Democratic Republic. You know how they used to make all those communist pretend names. But and then in 1990, they merged with Northern Yemen and became Yemen. But they can't get along. They can't. The Northern and the Southern Yemenis cannot get along. But that's not the British problem, because all of those countries, including all the other British protectorates in 1971, were given independence. They weren't really asking for it. The British just decided they were going to get rid of all territories east of the Suez Canal. And so they just left. But one of the federations over there that's still around today was the Trucial States. There's a bunch of little tiny sultanates, little Arabic kingdoms. I mean, really tiny, like we would call them city-states, like, or even town states. So they could never really make it on their own as an independent country. So they had united them around Abu Dhabi and all those little towns. In 1971, the British told them, we are going to leave, so it would be best for you to unite. Or one of these other Arab countries just come take you over. And they didn't want that, because that's what the Saudi family did. They took over a lot of other Arabic kingdoms. So they united as the United Arab Emirates, which is a federation of little Arab kingdoms. And they have like a ruling council. And they did listen to the British guidance, and they have done very well as a cooperative federation. And a lot of people don't realize that it is a federation, the UAE, United Arab Emirates. And what is an emirate? A little tiny kingdom ruled by an emir. And what is an emir? It's like a prince. It would be like, we would call it a grand duchy or a dukedom, or be like Luxembourg or Liechtenstein. Probably too small to be a kingdom, but like a principality or a grand duchy or just a duchy. Now we go into the governance of these Commonwealth realms. Okay, until the 1950s, really, I know in 1931 there was a Statute of Westminster, which was declaring that now the dominions are going to be considered equal to Great Britain. That didn't really, I mean, for the most part, it tended to be the case, but it wasn't really the case, as evidenced by World War II, but and how the British tended to regard the equal countries, basically saying, here's what we're going to do. Not what do you think we should do, but here's what we're going to do, which they had authority to do by virtue of King George VI was the king of Great Britain and the king of all those countries, the king in the countries. But there was a little resentment from the so-called grown-up countries like New Zealand and Australia, and they said, well, you know, if we're equal, then why are we treated like we're still kids? So the British say that's true, you know. So they really made a push starting in 1950 to truly regard those countries as equal family members. Now, when Great Britain interacts on an international level with, say, Canada or New Zealand or Australia or Papua New Guinea, which was created from Australian ruled territories in 1975, but it became a Commonwealth realm. Great Britain does not send an ambassador to Canada, because an ambassador represents the head of state. But you would have Queen Elizabeth, the Queen of Great Britain, sending an ambassador to represent Queen Elizabeth, the Queen of Canada. Now in 1952, they began to speak of the Queen as not the Queen in Canada. Now before that, they would always say the Queen in Canada or the Queen in Australia, the British Queen in Australia, when they would issue documents, whatever. But they began to use the term the Queen of Canada, the Queen of New Zealand, the Queen of South Africa, because they wanted to use the terminology which would show that the country was independent, and the Queen, they shared a monarch. The monarch of Great Britain was also the monarch of Canada. Not just, so when people say the British monarch is the Queen of Australia, today that would be incorrect. The correct way to say it would be that the British monarch is also the Queen of Australia. But the Queen of Great Britain is not going to send an ambassador to represent her to the Queen of Australia. So there's no ambassadors between the two countries. They have a high commissioner, which would be a person that represents the British Parliament's interests and negotiate with the Australian Parliament's interest, or Bahamas or Jamaica or whatever, okay? But there's no ambassadors. Now, in a country like New Zealand, which is a single state, a single country, there's simply a Governor-General who represents the Queen, not the British Parliament, because in 1986, and in Canada's case, 1982, but in 1986, Australia and New Zealand were given, how you say it, were given a treatment, I guess you say a treatment. The British Parliament passed laws saying that the British acts which created Australia, New Zealand, and Canada were now Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand. There are laws. So the British North America Act, which was the Constitution of Canada, because actually the Constitution of Canada was a British law. They said, well, from now on, from this point on in 1982, we're going to call it the Canada Act, and the law belongs to Canada. So now if Canada wants to amend her constitution, she can do so without the British Parliament approving it. Now, in the past, the British Parliament would always approve it. They would submit it to Parliament in England, and they would say, oh, the Canadians want to change this aspect of their law, and they would say, you know, they would approve it. But still, the Canadians said they felt like they were a colony because they still had to have the British Parliament approving some law they would make. So Queen Elizabeth went on a trip to her country of Canada, and you know, she's very clever, or her public relations people are very clever, and she will always say things like, I'm so glad I'm back in my country, or I'm so glad to be here in our country, talking about Canada or New Zealand or Jamaica, not your country. Okay, so the Canada Act and the New Zealand Act said that now those countries would have control over their own constitution, which is a law, British law. Now, the Governor-General of New Zealand represents the Queen, not the British Parliament anymore, but the Queen in New Zealand. The Governor-General represents the Queen in Australia. The Governor-General represents the Queen in Canada and the other 12 Commonwealth realms. But now, in the case of Canadian and Australian Federation, the Federation, now it no longer applies to South Africa because they broke away from Great Britain in 1961 by declaring themselves a republic, which caused no end of controversy because the English people there were happy to be still part of the Commonwealth, you know, being a realm. So there was a lot of animosity between the Dutch white people and the British white people, but that's another story. Okay. The Governor-General represents the Queen in Canada, or the Queen of Canada, and in fact reports to the Queen regularly, the Crown. Each Canadian province has a lieutenant governor, which represents the Queen in that province, not the Canadian government, but the Queen in London. So let's say you go to British Columbia and you're in the capital, Victoria, or you're in Saskatchewan and you're in the capital of Regina. There's a Governor-General, excuse me, a Lieutenant Governor who represents the Queen's interests in Alberta. Or there's, now in Australia they use the term governor, like the governor of Tasmania, who represents the Queen in Tasmania, not the Australian government in Canberra, but the Queen herself in London, or the Queen of Australia if she happens to be in country in Tasmania. So that's interesting, and they report back to the Queen to give reports on what's happening in Tasmania. And some people were saying that Australia, even though Australia was independent, the states were still colonies. Actually, the colonies, oh, I'm sorry, the states of Australia could appeal court decisions to the Queen's Privy Council in London. And in some of the Caribbean countries today, and in Brunei, which has its own sultan, and even in some of the republics that used to be British colonies, like Trinidad and Tobago, which declared themselves a republic in 1976. But even some of those republics in Jamaica and the Bahamas and all this, their Supreme Court is actually the Privy Council in London. They don't have a well enough developed legal system, judicial system, that they have their own Supreme Court. So even today, 2015, court cases in Jamaica can be appealed to the Privy Council in London, which is a fact. New Zealand had a problem with that. Australia had a resentment with that, and so they were saying, no, we don't want our states, we don't want an Australian state to be able to basically go over our head and appeal something to the Privy Council, some case to the Privy Council in London. So in 1986, with the Australia Act, that sort of ended it, but they actually had some legal cases where it was determined actually the Australians still could appeal, but the Supreme Court of Australia said, well, they just wouldn't do it, even though they could technically do it due to constitutional arrangements of the Australian government. They could actually technically still appeal to the British Privy Council. Now, New Zealand was in the same situation. They had the New Zealand Act of 1986, where New Zealand took control of her own constitution, the Dominion of New Zealand law of 1907 Dominion of New Zealand Act. But you could still, they could still appeal cases to the Privy Council in London. But finally, that's been extinguished through statute, and the last appeal to the Privy Council in New Zealand was finalized in March 2015. So they even had appeals to the Privy Council that were finally resolved. The cases were resolved in March of 2015. This is true. But the New Zealand territories like Niue and the Cook Islands, these are territories ruled by New Zealand, actually can still appeal cases not to the New Zealand Supreme Court in New Zealand's capital, but to London. They can still appeal to the Privy Council in London. So it's an interesting situation. We have no experience with that in America, in the United States, being completely independent in every way from Great Britain, since declaring it in 1776 and then, of course, achieving it in 1783. So it took a little while to achieve it. You can make any kind of declaration you want to make. You have to be able to back it up, which they were able to do by 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. Now, so today we have Commonwealth realms, which are independent countries, but they share the monarchy with Great Britain. Look at the Bahamas as an example before we close. I've been to the Bahamas, and there is the government house, big house up on a hill, a mansion, really. Well guarded. They wouldn't let me go in. And that's where that's the official residence of the Governor-General of the Bahamas, appointed by the Queen, on advice of the Prime Minister, of course. Really appointed by the Prime Minister. But that man or woman represents the Queen's interests in the Bahamas. The Prime Minister is the person who manages the day-to-day operations of the government of the Bahamas. The Prime Minister is a member of Parliament. The Parliament, the House of Commons in the Bahamas, and the Senate. There's the Senate in the Bahamas, just like in Canada, which is appointed, by the way. The Canadian Senate is also appointed, unlike the United States where it's elected. But the Governor-General has to approve all the laws or it doesn't become a law. But in practice, the Governor-General of the Bahamas never refuses to ratify a law. They could, though. They have reserve powers. If there was some madcap law being proposed, they could, theoretically, refuse to assert, refuse to, approve it. And that's not the right word, but they could refuse to give permission for the law to go into effect. In other words, they could veto it. Also, the Queen is the commander-in-chief of all the Bahamian armed forces and the Canadian armed forces. And that's why you're going to see the Canadian Air Force, or it's the Canadian Royal Air Force, the Canadian Royal Navy, the Canadian Royal Armed Forces. And they're always going to have a crown on their insignia. Look at the flags and the insignia of the Armed Forces of Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and there's always a crown. Or Belize. So they are kingdoms. If you go to Canada, Belize, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Grenada, St. Lucia, Barbados, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, etc., these are kingdoms. Who is the king? Queen Elizabeth II. Well, she's the queen. Maybe one day Charles III, right? So most Americans are so ignorant of government of their own country, not to mention Commonwealth realms. But I've always had an interest in these things. I'd be interested in your feedback if you care to reply. So that is the end of part 2, and probably the last video that will be made on Commonwealth realms. Although there is a lot more that could be said about it. Thank you for watching this video.